Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I'm going to be discussing something related to Dragon Ball Super, the series, and more specifically referring to the villains, or the main villains and antagonists of each particular arc in Super. And that question that I'm going to be posing to you guys today is, who is the best main villain or antagonist in Dragon Ball Super? And as you can see over here on my community tab, I have asked you guys this through a poll in which I asked you who is the best main villain or antagonist in Dragon Ball Super. And the results here are pretty interesting. You know, I kind of expected it perhaps to go in this direction of Goku Black and Zamasu winning the popular vote. However, I didn't necessarily think that it would be by such a wide margin. However, I'm going to be going through each individual villain and discussing why they have their own merits for being the best villain of Dragon Ball Super, or at least antagonist in the case of some of these guys. So let's take a look at these characters real quick. Now, Beerus, of course, is the one in Battle of Gods who kicked everything off, and he is the one who caused Goku to become the Super Saiyan God in the first place, through his overwhelming power, through his own prophetic dream in which he said that he wanted to seek out the Super Saiyan God because it might be a true rival to him, which, of course, in the greater scheme of Dragon Ball Super, you know, at the time that he actually fought Beerus, Goku certainly wasn't anything close to a rival for him. But, you know, Beerus truly showed that overwhelming power, and he was really the first movie villain to pretty much win in the end and be able to go on his own merry way. And of course, in Dragon Ball Super, he ended up becoming a character who is more friendly with Goku, who basically is involved in a number of the plots, but only indirectly. So Beerus is somebody kind of like Vegeta, who started out seemingly evil, wanting to destroy the Earth and Goku and fight him and, you know, everything like that. But I feel like he was a pretty good antagonist for the time, and he was one of those characters who really brought about this new renaissance of Dragon Ball and this breath of fresh air that we got after Battle of Gods, and, you know, all these new mechanics and dynamics were really kicked off by him. Now, next up in chronological order was Frieza, and I think in terms of a main villain or antagonist in Dragon Ball Super, Frieza is perhaps the weakest in terms of the Resurrection F arc, and the reason for that is because, of course, he was basically rehashing things we had seen in the past, like Cooler's Revenge, like we'd already seen with him versus Goku on Namek, and then him coming back as Mecha Frieza once again to get revenge in this movie after that. It was cool to see him train. It was cool to learn, I guess, a little bit more about his backstory, even though it was barely anything. And it was cool to see him, you know, build up this cool secondary antagonist in Tagoma. But really, Tagoma was the best part of that arc, and he was only a character that was basically just gonna get brushed out of the way for Captain Ginyu to take over his body. But overall, I feel like Frieza is probably the weakest link as a main villain antagonist for Dragon Ball Super. But of course, he later does other things which have certainly boosted his reputation since that arc. Now, up next would be Hit, who is tied for last place with Beerus. And I feel like, I guess, especially nowadays, Hit seems to get kind of a lot of flack. I feel like, I mean, sure, his character isn't super developed, but he does have a personality in terms of, you know, we see it slowly unfolding throughout his fight against Goku in the Tournament of Destroyers. You know, he has one of the coolest movesets in all of Dragon Ball with the Toki Tobashi, or time skip, in which he's able to literally create another dimension of time after skipping over time, so that he can attack people without them even being able to really counter what he's doing, aside from Goku, of course. And he's certainly a recurring character throughout Super. You know, they have him in the filler arc where he and Goku kind of face off again, and then we have some badass moments from him in the tournament, but, you know, ultimately he doesn't really do much after his first initial arc. But that's basically something you could say about most Dragon Ball villains, where, you know, in their initial arc they're the biggest bad around and they're super badass and they can beat Goku or at least push him to his very limits, you know, but then come the next arc, they're typically kind of like a chump. So, I mean, Hit certainly isn't a chump by the end of the series, but he's certainly not at the level of prominence he once was, but I certainly wouldn't say he's the worst overall. Now, of course, coming up next would have to be Goku Black and Zamasu, the overwhelming fan favorite in this case, which I'm certainly not surprised by. And yeah, I guess you could say that in some ways Goku Black / Zamasu is the baby of Dragon Ball Super. You know, that one really fleshed out, interesting villain that has motivations that are more understandable than most villains around him, who has an interesting arc that involves some high concepts, you know, somebody that pushes our characters extremely to their limits and causes them to either unlock a new transformation, or in this case to fuse, or in this case actually both, because even Trunks unlocked a new transformation fighting them. So I can certainly see a big argument for Goku Black / Zamasu being the main villain, and of course I put them together because Goku Black and Zamasu are really the same being, and eventually they become the same being, so it makes sense to put him here. And I can definitely see why the next character in Jiren is also where he is. Now, he might not be tied with Beerus and Hit for last place, but, you know, I could definitely see why he's not even close to Goku Black and Zamasu, just because of the fact that for most of the tournament and for most of the arc, we barely learn anything about him. His character isn't particularly developed, and even when they do develop him, it's still not really something that is really worth the wait. He has some awesome fight scenes, you know, him and Goku put on some great fights, you know, that's stylistically and aesthetically great, but when you break it down past that, you know, there are a lot of problems. In a lot of ways, that is very symptomatic of the arc itself, but when it comes to him being the best antagonist, I definitely wouldn't even put him close. And if we were including Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z, I feel like he might be an even lower percentage. However, of course, Jiren is also the most powerful antagonist. He is also a character who pushes Goku even further than I guess you could say anyone has ever pushed him before. However, Jiren is arguably the most powerful antagonist, especially if we don't count Beerus in this case, because who knows just how powerful the guy really is until Toriyama says he's been surpassed. And he certainly is a character who pushed Goku to his limits, I guess even more than anyone else ever has. So in that case, I guess, you know, you can say from that perspective, from the threat level, from, I guess, you know, him pushing Universe 7 and everyone else to the brink of non-existence, I guess you could say that that is some credibility for him taking that claim if you're just looking from a strict power perspective. And if you're looking just from a strict overall stakes for Universe 7 perspective in the main timeline, but I feel like in other regards, it's pretty obvious that he wouldn't take the #1 slot. But before I say who I think is the definitive best main villain or antagonist in Dragon Ball Super, let's take a look at some of your picks and some of your answers down below. Okay, first up we have Goku Black and Zamasu, and apparently he gives a number of different answers, so let me go through them real quick. Beerus is an ass pull for the series to give Goku a new transformation. He is stubborn and an uninteresting god of destruction, don't know about that. Frieza's in second place, he'd be first if he didn't whine like a bitch every time he loses. Hit is third, he doesn't really get enough screen time. Jiren is OP, but his design was underwhelming, as well as his backstory and explanation of power is basically non-existent, like Batman's, but way shorter. Goku Black / Zamasu may be overrated, but they have the most complex thought-out backstory. The only thing I didn't like is how Trunks destroyed Fuse Zamasu. The Spirit Bomb thing was cool, though. Yeah, I think that episode, even though it's very rushed and a lot of stuff that happens in it doesn't really make sense or is just like a blatant retcon, I think you can argue that it still has some really cool moments like this part. Goku Black and Zamasu again, only character introduced in Super that had any form of character development. I don't know about the character development thing. Hit's powers are cool, but no personality. Beerus isn't even a villain. Well, that's why I made sure to say antagonist, which, you know, people always try and get on me about saying, oh, Beerus and Jiren aren't actually villains. I know. They're antagonists. Trust me, it's not the exact same thing, but a villain can be an antagonist. In fact, depending upon your perspective, a lot of protagonists are also antagonists too. Goku Black and Zamasu again. The best main villain was obviously the animation. Well, I guess you could say earlier in the show, but as the show goes along, except for reused animation maybe, it gets a lot better. Just look at the first 3 arcs compared to the end of the Tournament of Power. It's night and day. Goku Black and Zamasu, with the real answer being Cell. Yeah, I mean, he's the best of Dragon Ball ever. Just like Terminator 2 is always going to be the best Terminator movie of every single year, because I could just pop that thing right in my Blu-ray player. Goku Black and Zamasu again, wish we had more original villains who are actually villains. Well, a lot of people in Super are antagonists, but not villains. Goku Black, Zamasu. Beerus, Hakai. That's certainly a good enough argument for me. Beerus can just raise his hand and Hakai, you go bye-bye, I guess. Goku Black and Zamasu again. Frieza, here we go. He was the first main bad guy and saw him through the series. I don't know if I'd really say that because, you know, if we're counting Dragon Ball Z even, you could say that Raditz might have been the first main bad guy, but then of course you have Vegeta, you know, the Saiyan arc is Vegeta is the big bad of the Saiyan arc, and Frieza is the next arc, and then Dragon Ball you had other villains, so not too sure about the first main bad guy. Black was never mentioned in the Tournament of Power. Yeah, well, that is one of the biggest problems with the Future Trunks arc. A lot of the things that happen in it don't necessarily have long-lasting effects in the following arc, but of course there is one big exception, or little exception, depending upon how you look at him. And that being Zeno. Frieza, the Future Trunks arc was so bad, wake up people. Well, I don't know about the whole arc. Goku Black and Zamasu, Jiren was mistreated, Frieza did nothing, Beerus wasn't a villain, again, there's the Antagonist, and Hit was severely mistreated later on, I guess. Goku Black and Zamasu actually did stuff. Yeah, they might have accomplished more than any villain in the entire franchise, so that's certainly a positive for them. Goku Black and Zamasu, Goku Black and Zamasu, another Frieza, Jiren, Beerus. So overall, as you could see, most people are saying Goku Black and Zamasu, which it's really hard for me, or I guess most other people, to really be able to say that that's incorrect. I mean, for me, the other people who have the biggest argument for being the best main villain or antagonist in Dragon Ball Super would have to be Beerus, because Beerus, again, kicked everything off, but you can argue that he debuted in Dragon Ball Z, technically, since Battle of Gods was a Dragon Ball Z movie, but he really did open the door and changed so many different things up, even though that might not have carried on because of Frieza's own arc. And the other person I would say that comes close would be Hit, just because Hit is a lot like Pikkon, and his arc is kind of like the Afterlife tournament, in which, you know, it's kind of just a big action set piece, and, you know, there's not like a whole lot of stakes comparative to the other arcs, and it isn't exactly the longest one, but he was certainly a character that made a lot of us really interested at the time, and certainly made us wonder if Goku could even overcome him, which you can argue that he never truly did. But ultimately, I have to agree with the majority of people in saying that Goku Black and Zamasu are the best villain in Dragon Ball Super. They're the most fleshed out, they're the most accomplished of pretty much any villain in the franchise, unless you want to count Zeno as a villain, depending upon your perspective there. I mean, Future Trunks' timeline might not have been too happy with that, but then again, most people were dead there. But in terms of overall quality of villain and antagonist, I would have to say that Goku Black and Zamasu pretty much stand head and shoulders above the rest. So who do you think is the best main antagonist in Dragon Ball Super? Let me know your own thoughts down below in the comments. And of course, you can always come over here and vote in this poll. It is still ongoing. And after this video is over, you can also check out my review here of Incredibles 2. Is it as good as the original Incredibles, or maybe even better? You could check that out right here, and my movie channel, Laughingstock Cinema, which will be in the end screen and description of this video. And if you're new to the channel, then make sure to subscribe and enable notifications so you could see all of my content right away when it comes out. And stick around, because there's a lot more to come in the future.
Yeah, and you better subscribe, enable those damn notifications.